Hello, this is Bill Meridian speaking to you today in June of 2015 from New York City. This is the sixth in a series of planetary stock trading videos. This one is entitled Group Analysis. Now, as anyone who analyzes the markets knows, stocks are grouped according to sector and to group. There are 10 major sectors in the U.S. It differs by national stock market. As I like to say, birds of a feather flock together and stocks of a feather move together. So they tend to be highly correlated, as you might imagine. A group of horoscope of stocks within the same industry or stock group reveals degree areas that are relevant to price changes for the entire group. Once these degrees are identified, major transits through these degree areas cause price movements in that group or sector. And this is just a piece of research from the world of Wall Street. Research does demonstrate that if you hold the strongest stock in the strongest group and the strongest stock in the weakest group, the difference will be about 5% annually. That's 500 basis points. In other words, if you have the strongest stock in a very strong group, it will tend to outperform the strongest stock in the weakest group by about 5%, 500 basis points annually. So there is a degree of guilt by association, so to speak, that will hold a stock back if it is in a weak group. Now, over the years, I've noticed, for example, that the U.S. stocks in the U.S. market, the banks show a lot of planets in the Taurus-Scorpio axis, which makes sense symbolically, so that it was no surprise when the Saturn-Neptune opposition occurred in 2007 from Leo to Aquarius, square to the fixed axis at Taurus-Scorpio, the entire group fell. Way back in the old days of steam-powered computers, when I started out, there was a very small automobile industry. It was GM, Ford, and Chrysler. There were no shared degrees. That's because that was a mature industry. If one company benefited, it can only do so by taking market share away from the other. As one stock went up, the others went down. So if you have such an industry group, it is usually a mature group where one factor does not affect all companies and stocks equally. Now, the group averages are price indices constructed from stocks within the group or sector. These can be capitalization weighted, price weighted, or equally weighted. Let me just briefly tell you the difference. S&P uses capitalization weighting. The cap-weighted indices can be dominated by one or two large companies. I actually remember one group that I had to follow in which there were, I think, 6 companies, and one company was 55% of the market capitalization of the entire group. So that one company dominated the movements. Price-weighted indices are dominated by high-price stocks, the way M dominates the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and I vastly prefer equally weighted groups, such as those in the Value Line Investment Survey and Investors Business Daily. Now let's look at the software group first. Here we have the first trade chart of Microsoft. And we have the midheaven at 12 Aquarius and the sun at 22, 23 Pisces. The thing I like about such stocks, such new stocks, is there's no question as to the date the first trade occurred. This was not Uncle Elmer's cola company started in 1880 in a barn out in Oklahoma. The history of some of these companies goes way back, gets confusing and complicated. But as we move forward in time, that is not much of a concern anymore. Now let's take a look at the big 3 software stocks. Microsoft is the outer wheel. The middle wheel is Oracle. I'm sure you all know Oracle. And then Intuit is the inner wheel. And wait a minute, is that my imagination? Are the midheavens on all these stocks 11 to 12 Aquarius? Yes, they are. Are the suns all 22 to 23 Pisces? Yes, they are. This is what I mean by shared degree area. I put this example up first because I wanted to give you a very striking example of how this can just jump out at the screen off of you. I've been observing this now since the 70s, and it's really amazing the way it works. The old LSI logic, ticker symbol LLSI, on the NASDAQ jumped to the New York Stock Exchange under the ticker symbol LSI. If you took the NASDAQ first trade chart and you superimposed it or did a synastry between that and the New York Stock Exchange chart, you picked up a lot of shared degree areas. Well, this makes sense. Let's just say you start a company and you write down a history of the company. You start the company, let's say, in 1950. In 1960, you made a significant acquisition of another company. You write that date down. Let's say 5 years later, there is some major change. 10 years later, some new product you adopt that is of great benefit to the company. The original incorporation horoscope in this case would be related to all of these subsequent moves, because just remember, the natal charts of the later developments are what? They were transits to the original incorporation chart. And if you believe in astrology, then something by transit has to affect or influence the incorporation chart as time moves forward. So if you have a major change of leadership of the company, if the company is sold to another group, if it merges some smaller companies, starts some new products, all of those charts at one point were transits until they actually manifested. So if you put them all into a program and you look for shared degree area, it'll jump out at you. So that is how that works. Now let's look at shared degree area. Let's look at IBM. IBM has a very dynamic first trade chart. And by the way, IBM reincorporated and adopted this name and ticker symbol all on the same day. So this one chart represents first trade incorporation. It's a very significant chart. There is an earlier one from 1915, but I find it is less effective than this one. And you'll notice I have outlined the moon at 14 Gemini, Mars and Jupiter conjunct 16 Sagittarius, and Uranus 16 Pisces. If you put this on a 90-degree dial, it jumps right out at you. Now, let's compare the IBM chart as the inner wheel with Lexmark, which is the middle wheel, with Computer Associates CA, which is the outer wheel. And note all of those planets in Sagittarius. Also look at Pisces. Not too much in Gemini. And you also see some planets in Virgo. But you note that the central decade of mutable signs tends to be very heavily populated for the big old line heavy metal technology stocks. I use this to great advantage, and in I think the very first edition of Planetary Stock Trading I pointed out how even Venus and Mars transits into these areas affected the whole group short term. Now, Saturn-Pluto opposition in 2001 and 2007, well, they couldn't have been opposite in 07, but the Saturn-Pluto opposition in 2001 was from Pluto to Sagittarius, and remember, the whole market collapsed, but technology got hurt even worse than the entire market. Then Saturn went into Virgo, which is what I meant to say up at the top in the title, and 2007, 2008, down they go again. So, Saturn entered Sagittarius in January 2015, which was now 5 months ago, but it has not gotten to the central decade yet. When it gets there, it is probably going to send this whole group down again. And that is going to take place sometime in 2016 in the first quarter. So you can anticipate that. But before that happens, Jupiter will trine Pluto in the autumn of 2015. Jupiter will be in Virgo, Pluto will be in Capricorn. That's the fourth quarter of the year, which is traditionally the strongest for the S&P 500. It is the strongest for technology, and on top of that, you have a Jupiter-Pluto trine. So therefore, in the fourth quarter of 2015, we should get a very strong price rise in this group, but it should quickly reverse in January of 2016. I specifically included this example in this presentation because rarely do you see what I call the stop and reverse, which is where you go from very well or poorly aspected to very poorly or well aspected, and you get a spike up and a reverse straight down. Now let's take a look at one of my favorite old examples. This is the airline group in 2007, just in case you want all the details. Now, this is 8 years old, but the first time I did it was around 1980. And what is remarkable is that I'm going to drop down here and we'll come back to this slide. The dominant signs, when you include the node, the midheaven, the ascendant, and all the planets, the dominant sign in that group of stocks is Gemini Sagittarius. Isn't that very reflective or indicative or symbolic of flight and travel? So I'll let you just take a look at that. That is all of the planets. Moon through Pluto. I left out the asteroids. I left out the Uranian planets. I included the node. I included the midheaven and the ascendant. So just take a look at that and get familiar with it. We'll jump up and now read some of the conclusions. After 10 years and numerous changes in the industry and the inclusion of some foreign airlines, Gemini Sagittarius is still the dominant axis as it was way back when I first did this. In the 80s, 90s, it was the same. And Sagittarius is the single most populated sign. Fire is the dominant element. And we're going to look at another slide. Searching the fourth harmonic, we find that 16 degrees of fixed and 20 and 27 mutable are the most populated by planets and angles. The two most dominant aspects are the opposition and the 300-degree angle. The Saturn-Pluto opposition in 2001 also sank this group. That was just prior to 9/11. And Saturn entered Sagittarius in January of 2015, which is bearish. Now I'm going to jump down. Here is the fourth harmonic degree distribution. Once again, this is all the planets. It's the node, the midheaven, and the ascendant. And here we put it on what we would call a 90-degree sort. So now, any of you who listened to 2 webinars I did last year, 2014, know that I said that when Saturn enters Sagittarius, it will be bearish for the airline group. Well, there you see the Standard & Poor's airline index. And when did it top? January 2015, just as Saturn entered, and I doubt the airline group will recover soon. Now, in my business, I generally can't say Saturn going into Sagittarius, so what do you say? Well, first of all, look at that rate of ascent. I can say to anybody in the investment world, this has become excessive. I can say on a fundamental basis, the airline stocks are expensive in terms of valuation. But there are a number of other factors. The price of oil may or may not go up. A recession may cause people to simply stop taking so many flights. There may be some other industry group that just has much better prospects, and investors start shifting out of this group into another because it is a relative game. Or it could be that the psychology has just changed. There's an old cartoon of a fellow on the phone with his broker, and he says, I just came from the company meeting. The president says, things can't get any better. Sell the stock. And the guy on the other end says, why do you want to sell? And the investor says to his broker, well, if things can't get any better, how is this stock going to go up any further? I think that's the case with the airlines. Used to be a cyclical group before this bull market, and it did start around the time Jupiter was in Gemini. So Jupiter and Gemini bullish, Saturn and Sagittarius now bearish. So I think I've given you a very complete and succinct approach to analyzing stock groups. I do the same thing with mundane astrology, which I have not made any presentations about, but For example, the Hellenistic cultures, according to my old teacher Charles Jane, have dominant planets or degree areas historically in the central decadent of cardinal signs. Well, Hellenic means Greece, and we currently have Pluto and Uranus. They're not exactly square, but they're close to being square in that degree band, and look where Greece is right now. Probably the bear market low. So the same thing works with group dynamics, groups of people, or groups of countries. Now, of course, here's the blatantly free market capitalistic advertisement. Planetary Stock Trading, now in its 4th edition, the world's only purple financial astrology book. You can get it at BillMeridian.com, as well as Cycles Research Early Warning Service newsletter and the other books. If you really are interested in this work, then go to astroapp.com. I have worked on this website with my friend Jean Vicutan. We have all the stocks that I use. I update it every Sunday from Barron's, and so we take out the old stocks, put in the new ones, and you can do this type of work. You can break the stocks up into groups, and Jean is adding tools to enable you to do this type of group analysis there. You pay a subscription fee for the website, very reasonable, another fee, very reasonable, to get into the financial section. And if you do some work and save it, let's just say you get busy with something else, you let your subscription expire. When you go back, your files will still be there. So this is the type of group work that you can do at AstroApp. I hope you've enjoyed today's presentation. Looking forward to the next one. Bill Meridian in New York. Bye-bye.